On March 30th, 2019, a bright, crisp, early spring day in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a gathering was held at the Cambridge Friends Meeting House. This day was an opportunity for an enthusiastic audience to witness a continuing conversation, a meeting of minds, between Dr. Richard Schwartz, founder of IFS, or Internal Family Systems, and Lama John Makransky, developer of ICT, or Innate Compassion Training, which is derived from Tibetan Buddhism. Joining them as discussants were Lama Willa Miller, a Dharma teacher and founder of Natural Dharma Fellowship, and Dr. Edward Yates, a psychotherapist who has studied and practiced in both traditions. Offered as a day-long workshop, there were conceptual presentations, experiential guided practices, a video presentation, an animated, inspiring conversation about spiritual practice and the many parallels and potential synergy between IFS and Tibetan Buddhism. What follows is a series of highlights from this groundbreaking event. If you're already clear that you want to experience the workshop as a whole, you might want to skip this highlight video, return to the website, and access the professionally produced document of the event. Otherwise, we hope these selected clips will give you a taste of what happened that day and inspire you to go deeper. Welcome to highlights from Becoming Our Compassionate Self, integrating parts of ourselves into the process of spiritual awakening.
That's a basic premise of the model, that everybody's a multiple personality, and that's a good thing. I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomena. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And we work with parts that have murdered people, that have molested little kids, and I'm telling you, even those parts, when approached from this place of curiosity and compassion, will tell their secret histories of how they were forced into these roles that they hate, and they carry the perpetrator's energy and they as the burden and all of that, and how much they would love to be released from those roles. And that's a lot of what we do. So it's a very non-pathologizing, empowering view of the mind, and it allows people to actually do a lot of work on their own that's transformative. So that's the basic assumption, that everybody's a multiple, it's a good thing. These parts are in their naturally valuable state until we have trauma, until we have attachment injury, at which point they're forced into roles that can be damaging and that they hate often to protect us. And so it's sort of like a family. It's like a kid in a family who's in his naturally happy state, and then because of the dynamics of the family or the trauma the family suffers, is forced to become what in family therapy we call a parentified child, who has to take on a lot of parental responsibility, doesn't trust the parents anymore, and has to kind of run things. So it's a really apt parallel. Second assumption, and this one is where we are really on a lot of common ground, is that in addition to these parts, and as they open space, released is this essence that we all have that can't be damaged and knows how to heal, both internally and externally. And that's another thing I just stumbled into, because as I was trying to get these parts to get along better with each other, get my client to get along better with their parts, I would have dialogues, because I'm a family therapist, and using the chairs sometimes, but one client said, I can just sit here and do it. So ever since then, people just sit there and do it. And I'm trying to have, now that I know the parts aren't what they seem, I'm trying to get my client to listen and appreciate them and have a different kind of relationship with them. So I'm having these dialogues. And let's say I'm having a bulimic kid talk to her critical mother, or critical part that resembles her mother. And it's going okay, and then suddenly she gets angry at the critic. And it reminded me of family sessions where you might have a teenage girl trying to talk to her critical mother, have them get along better. Suddenly the girl's mad at the mother. We were taught to look around the room and see if somebody isn't siding with the girl against the mother. And we'll find that person, often the father, covertly siding, and ask that father to step back in the room, and suddenly things go better between the daughter and the mother. Everybody following this? Maybe the same thing's happening with his inner system. So I would say, could you find the part that hates the critic who's doing the talking? And could you get it to just step back in there? And to my amazement, clients would say, okay, it did. And I'd say, okay, now how do you feel toward the critic? And it would be an entirely different answer. In the direction of, I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names. Seconds earlier, hated it or was terrified of it. You get that to step back, it seems to release this other person. Curious, calm, confident, and often spontaneously compassionate. I feel sorry for it that it has to do this all the time. I want to help it. I want to help it. That blew my mind, because I was working with clients who had horrible histories. And if you were trained like I was in psychology, you would think they couldn't have any of that ego strength inside because of their histories, because they never got it from a parent. But it turns out you don't need to get it from a parent. It's our birthright. And that's something that we really have in common, that it's Buddha nature, Rigpa. That's what I stumbled into. By simply getting these parts to open space, this other person showed up with these great qualities of curiosity. We have what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. Curiosity, compassion, confidence, calm, clarity. So the part would even look different suddenly. They would see it, a monster turns into a little teenage kid. Creativity, ability to relate in much more flexible ways. Connectedness, which again is a big commonality, because when people would access this, they no longer felt alone. They felt connected to everything, everybody else, and to the earth. And that would drive their compassion, that sense of, I'm not that different from you, and when you suffer, I suffer too. That comes with this experience of self. And the desire to connect to other people, to parts, and to help them. And so as people were entering that state, I think I forgot one. What was it? Courage, yes. So as I was having clients working inside, they would see these abysses or inner basements or dungeons. And whereas they were terrified to go there, when they would access this place, they'd say, okay, let's go. Let's go find what's in there. So courage. Yeah, so self is in everybody, can't be damaged, and is the big deal of IFS. It's what I think I'm bringing to psychotherapy. You guys already knew about it, but it's... and what I love about this tradition is that it's already there. It's already there. It doesn't need to develop. You don't need to build the muscle of compassion. You need to help release it, and that is basically what I believe too. We tend to go first to what I call protectors, learn about them. And they're often the parts that are creating the symptoms the client's bringing to us. And instead of going and trying to fight these parts into submission and get them to change what they're doing, as I did initially with that cutting part, we go to get to know them first. So you get your client in self, so they become immediately curious rather than afraid of or attacking of, and begin a dialogue. And in the process of that dialogue, we'll ask a question like, ask this part what it's afraid would happen if it didn't do this job inside. And in answering that question, you'll learn about what it's protecting, and then we can actually show it a lot of appreciation for at least trying to keep you safe through your life. And the part will soften to that and tell you more, and so on. And then negotiate permission to go to what it protects and heal that, and then come back to it, and now it's very happy to not do what it's been doing. And we can help it unburden, release the emotions and beliefs it's been carrying, at which point it almost magically will immediately transform into its naturally valuable state. So this is a process by which we befriend our enemies. That was my big line with the Dalai Lama. You tell us to go to our external enemies with compassion. Why not to our internal enemies too? So that's a critique I have, not so much of these guys, but of Buddhism in general and most spirituality, that there's a tendency to vilify certain kinds of parts. The ego is, at least at best, a pest, and at worst, an enemy. And you wind up exiling those parts. And so this is what's terribly exciting to me about this dialogue is the degree to which we can together help people in your community also begin to listen to and respect these protective parts.
I think one of the things that's operative in Buddhism, in the Buddhist community, is this myth of perfection, and that one of the pitfalls, perhaps, or the stumbling blocks of these teachers is all of us, is the myth that somehow there is a state to attain that is beyond these parts, beyond as in you can completely transcend the parts. And what I appreciate deeply about the IFS model is the permission to befriend the parts rather than transcend the parts. And I think we could learn a lot in our community from that, because when you think about it, the pressures on a Buddhist teacher to appear to be the embodiment of perfection are significant, right? Because everyone, we all think, oh, they're looking to me, right? So it isn't surprising to me that not just Buddhist leaders, but leaders in general fail. Or rather suppress the darkness, and that comes bubbling up, right? Because that's what we all do.
The reason I do it by getting to know parts and having them step out with their permission is because I come at this from a very different place. I worked with severe trauma for about 20 years, people with all this serious diagnosis, with this model, and found that many times their protectors didn't want them to feel any of that, because to feel that would be very dangerous, because they might take risks, they might feel confident and do something that would get them more pain. And many of them had had the experience of when they were with their perpetrator, anytime they showed any of these qualities, they would get more torture. So there was a very natural fear of accessing that then, and when I would try to do it in a deliberate way, there would be this huge pushback. So I learned to help these parts open space by convincing them, or not convincing, but yeah, I'm kind of what I call a hope merchant. I'm selling hope to these hopeless systems that it might be safe just for a second to let the client feel a little bit of this. And it's almost a desensitization process where they try a little more and they feel a little more. Point I'm making is I do believe there's a percentage of the spiritual population who comes from that kind of background. And so for them, either they'll pretend but they're not really accessing it, or they access it and they feel terrible, or they don't access it despite all the practices, and then they feel like they're a loser. So, so that's another thing that I think most people, will be able to do it and will feel really good about it. But I also want to include the population for whom it's going to be a big challenge.
So how do we begin, if not just with a sense that we're a separate self taking up a self-help technique, then what? And that is, it begins in the various cultures, and here I'll talk about Asian Buddhist cultures. As you grow up in that culture from the time you're a child and are enculturated into it more and more and socialized into it, there's a growing awareness, belief, understanding, and communal and cultural experience that many people before you, many beings before you, over the generations before you, and also all around you, have been cultivating this possibility. And you are already held in those powers of love and compassion and wisdom. Does that sound familiar to anybody? You are already held in it. We love because first we were loved. First letter of John. This is the very heart of Christianity, this pattern. It's also, I would argue, the very heart of the entire history of Buddhism, but has been largely hidden as Buddhism is adapted and brought into our autonomous, modernistic senses of self that shut out this foundational pattern. What I'm suggesting is what empowers us to see others more in the depth of their being and respond to them more in the depth of their being and not stop at superficial, reductive and limited images, impressions, and socially conditioned labels. What empowers us to sense that there's a depth to people. In order for that to happen, we need to be seen in the depth of our being. We need to experience that. And indeed, I would argue, to some degree we all have, or we probably wouldn't be alive. The experience of being seen as a being with deep dignity and potential, deep worth, beyond limiting valuations. How are you useful to me? Beyond that. The experience of being seen and being held in an all-inclusive power of love and compassion and wisdom is an empowerment. And that's a central word in Tibetan Buddhism, empowerment. That's the core empowerment, being seen. It's called pure perception in Tibet. An empowerment to become an extension of that field of love and compassion, to be incorporated into it, to hold many others in it. And that's what in social psychology we would call a tremendously secure base and a flow of loving energy that can help practitioners sense others in their dignity and worth beyond the reductive labels and seriously begin to cut through in-group, out-group bias and begin to heal tendencies toward empathy, fatigue, and burnout. So that's where we're going in the next hour or so. So this got formulated into a kind of a pattern of practice, which is in 3 modes, and which has been called Innate Compassion Training, because it involves accessing innate capacities or powers of our being and actually beginning to experience them, not just talk about them or believe in them. Innate Compassion Training, sometimes also called Sustainable Compassion Training, for a more sustaining power of care and compassion that helps prevent burnout. The 3 modes of Innate Compassion Training are a receptive mode, a deepening mode, and an extending mode. And these are based on the pattern both within Tibetan Buddhism that I see in other spiritual traditions as well. So could you feel a shift in your awareness begin to unfold at that point in the meditation? What I mean by shift in your awareness, it's not quite the same quality of awareness that you walked into the room with. Something shifted. So settle into the felt sense of this loving moment with its loving energies or qualities. Let them infuse your whole being. Just settle into the felt sense of that. Just receptivity. Can you name a quality that came with that shift in your awareness? So I'm inviting you now. And actually for this, we don't need the mic. I'm going to repeat. Can you just name qualities? So just name one quality that you notice came with that shift, and I'll repeat it so everyone can hear. Sorry? Warmth. expansiveness, deep, comfort, light. Repeat, please. Beauty. Settled. Gentle. Deep. Deep, calm. Open, openness. Sweetness. Safety. Trust. Joy. Connected. That's interesting. Yeah. Calm, connection, clarity. We'll spell sweetness with a C so we can. But then after we find some access, then what we're doing is really, the whole purpose of it is actually cultivating a kind of a skill, a power of receptivity, and that's that needs to be cultivated. And in the process of doing that, there may be parts of our mind and emotion that realize what we're doing. Another way to phrase it is just what was brought up. What we're cultivating is a kind of vulnerability. And it's a vulnerability to the energies and qualities of love, compassion, wisdom, and other qualities, the ones we named and others. It's a vulnerability to those qualities of our fundamental awareness, or what Dick would call our self with a capital S. However, parts of us have been concerned to protect us from vulnerability. For fear we may be hurt. Because we all have pasts in which we've associated becoming more open in a way that we really need to be receptive to care and love and warmth, and then we're disappointed or hurt by what happened. So there are parts of us that do not want us to go there. The various parts of us think, and as Dick said, many of them emerged in our childhood and took on protective roles. Those parts of us think that these energies and qualities of love and compassion come only from outside of us. I'll repeat that. See what you think. But these parts of us, often from childhood, which are still with us now and therefore are a part of our childhood now in a sense, think that these powers of love and compassion and loving energy come only from outside of us, and therefore their jobs have long been to manage and protect things in such a way as to be very cautious about how open or receptive we may become to these loving energies and qualities which can only come from outside of us, and so our receptivity to what's outside of us needs to be managed very carefully so we don't get hurt again. These parts of us are trying to help us. And this connects very deeply to certain Tibetan Buddhist traditions. That there's actually some fundamental goodness, wisdom, caring quality at the very heart of every part of us. They're trying to help us, and they're expressing their care for us in that way. This is Tantric Buddhism. But they're a bit confused in the way that I just said. They think that these loving energies and qualities can come only from outside of us. Therefore, for our safety, they have to manage it very carefully and defend us against increasing vulnerability unless and until they comprehend that it's safe enough for us. And they don't really comprehend the self, or our Buddha nature, because our Buddha nature, or our deepest dimension of our awareness, or the self as Dick calls it, cannot be captured and caught in any particular identity or label. It's the fundamental awareness that can take expression or take shape in all kinds of ways, all kinds of labels and emotions and parts. It can take expression in all those ways. But that fundamental awareness in itself transcends identification with all the parts. That's different from transcending the parts. It transcends being identified with any of the parts. And in that way, it can be present to any part without being caught up in only one part. So the mind's learning it doesn't have to be totally identified with any part that comes up. And it learns that by embracing the part in the love and compassion of our fuller awareness, that's, you could say, is larger than any part, is not able to be reduced to any one part, our larger awareness. And that's called unblending in IFS terms, beginning to unblend. And in that way, we're learning how to begin to inhabit our fuller awareness, just beginning what Dick would call our self with a capital S. We're beginning to inhabit our fuller fundamental awareness, which is more than any one part and can hold any part in compassion and care. We're learning in this way to begin to inhabit our fuller awareness, the fuller awareness that can embrace all parts of us in compassion without being identified with any part. And then in the releasing phase, the last part of the meditation, where it says, see if this felt sense of love and acceptance and warmth can help your mind trust enough to relax and just let go of its frameworks and just relax into utter openness, undivided from awareness. So in that deepening part, we can start to settle into that fuller awareness, which is not identified with any one part, and which can embrace all parts. And that fuller awareness, which we're learning to begin to settle into, you're following me? In that releasing phase, utter openness and cognizance. That fuller awareness can also hold others and their parts and their feelings in love and compassion better than any part of us can. Alone, on its own, out of touch with that fuller awareness. That fuller awareness can not only hold our parts in care and love and compassion and deep discernment and wisdom. That fuller awareness is already holding others and their parts and their feelings similarly before we even think about it. Just by being present, learning to become more and more present in ourself, with a capital S, as Dick would put it, our fuller awareness, as I'm saying. So, what to do between meditation sessions? Just what Dick was doing in his session, that we can find ourselves becoming less threatened by these parts of us, less afraid of them, less, oh, you're just an impediment to my spiritual practice, go away thing, or whatever. Less identified with another part at war with this part or that part. So then we're learning that in the meditation session or through Dick's kind of inquiry. Then between meditation sessions, there can be just a more natural sense of welcoming. We're learning to welcome parts. Learning to deeply accept them rather than demand that they go away or be redefined on our own terms, which is actually another part trying to redefine this part. Deeply accepting them, and with that almost automatically will come curiosity rather than fear. Really curious. And with that curiosity and sense of acceptance and compassion or care, then we can learn from them. So that can become an internal dialogue. What would you like me to know? And then we listen. We don't on our own try to think up an answer. Just like Dick said, we listen for what the part might say, and it's often surprising and revealing and revelatory what the part has to reveal.
I think I'll start with what I see as a big advantage to the collaboration, because we do this healing work in sessions, and then we try to get our clients to follow up and work with their parts between sessions, but we don't really have a practice to offer people like what you just did, which you kept saying the word trust, and that is basically what this is about from my point of view. It's about accessing self or awareness and helping parts trust that it's safe to do that and it's actually beneficial to the whole system to do that. And so then the more you can do it in the big way that you allowed at least me to do, and then not exclude them and embrace them, like you said, then the more they trust that self can be this inner leader and can also lead in the outside world. So the practices themselves become trust-building sessions. So the parts more and more, because as I said earlier, most of these protective parts don't trust self. They don't know self most of the time. They don't know there's anybody in there that can be an effective leader because of what's happened in the past and how when you were young you weren't able to protect the system and they had to step up. So just that much, just seeing them as these practice sessions of trust in self-leadership, in my language, is really, really valuable. And that is, we have three main goals in IFS. The first is the release of these parts from their extreme roles to be who they're designed to be. The second is that one, is helping the parts come to trust there is this other person in there that can do much more and can love in this way. And then the third is the reharmonizing of the whole system, which is fostered by the embracing, by self-embracing them in the way you describe. So in a way, these are all achieving what we try to achieve.
Would you say that in order to understand, to have some degree of understanding of what somebody else is going through and the kinds of sufferings that they're experiencing, I've operated with the assumption that some degree of empathy is necessary. Otherwise, we can too easily just intellectualize.
Very much.
And so what I'm going to ask is, but I think I know the answer, but just I'm not sure, that the possibility of empathy without being overwhelmed
Yes.
by the suffering burdens that others are experiencing, which we then take on.
Yeah.
That the possibility of being able to empathize with, without being overwhelmed by, also has to do with maintaining connection or knowing how to reconnect with what you would call the self, and letting whatever we're feeling ourselves when with another be basically held in self-energy.
I totally agree with that too, and this is another one of those parallels where if you can't be with your own exiles without being overwhelmed, you can't be with somebody who's acting like them or resonating with them or makes them resonate. So it's all parallel. How you can be with your parts will allow you to be with your own. So before I had done a lot of exile work, I would be with somebody like that, and I might look present, but my mind is thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch, or just it was too hard to be with that level of pain. Or I might even try to fix her in a big way, or be really empathic, and all that would get in the way. So there's no way to avoid, and this I think applies to if you want to be a bodhisattva, you've got to be a bodhisattva inside first. And then you can do that in the outside world. So
That's a discussion at one point I had with Ed, I think, but it seemed it was dawning on me, and maybe you at the same time, in some conversation that we had at some point, Ed having trained with Dick for some years now, that it was striking me in light of your work as it's coming into my work, that the Bodhisattva vow, which is like this indomitable vow, that I will never give up until all beings, all sentient beings are deeply free, most deeply well. That vow has to be made toward all of our parts.
that's right.
And until we learn that, and that's a big learning,
That's really great.
the outer vow is totally impossible. And I was hearing that in the video. There's a moment with her own exiled part when there was something like a vow that you will never be left alone again,
right.
ever. Indomitable,
And that was when the part really relaxed. For me, the enlightenment is the shift in your identity, the shift in your sort of center of gravity from your parts to yourself. That's all it is. When you really get that, and you can access at least some of it, it changes everything in terms of who you think you are and how you relate to everybody else. So, and that's an achievable definition of enlightenment, I think.
We had 3 modes: receptive mode, deepening mode, right from receptive into the trusting. The loving energy can help us to trust enough to let go of our narrow grip on parts of ourself and just trust the source of the loving energies. That's the deepening mode, and settle right into that source, which is our fundamental awareness and openness, which has all those qualities or capacities already innately inbuilt. And now we're going to go into the extending mode. But the extending mode, which involves also an inclusion of others, just as we've included all of our parts in the receptive mode and the deepening mode, the extending mode will be a very natural extension of that, in which we find we're with others and we're present to others in a way which is just naturally and almost of itself automatically also holding them and all their parts and feelings similarly. Not from some part of ourself trying to be super spiritual and do all that, but more from what Dick would call the self, which is beyond identification with any one part and therefore can hold all parts in compassion. What are we? We are embodied awareness. That's pretty simple. And that awareness is not any particular identity, but it has the capacity to become this or that identity, or inhabit this or that role. I could be a teacher, I could be a father, I could be a brother. So what are we? We're not any one of those identities. We are the fundamental awareness and openness that can then take on any identity according to circumstances. That's all. So what does that mean? So then words come up that often just become confusing rather than helpful because they have a long history to them and a number of different meanings associated with them. So what is this? Is this self or no self? Well, that basic openness and awareness is what I would say Dick calls self with a capital S, and which I would say transcends identification with any one identity, is not reducible to any one identity, and for that reason can give rise to many kinds of identity, and therefore it is not any one self in the sense of any particular identity. So that's no self. So the self is no self. So to discover the true self is to discover the true meaning of no self.
I believe that when we do a meditation like that, it isn't just for our little individual experience, that we're actually bringing more self to this planet, to this plane. That the same is true whenever in our offices we unburden a client, is bringing more self to this place. And my also part of the belief that keeps me going is that someday I'll make a bumper sticker that says self heals. So when you get the critical mass of self in any level of system, healing just spontaneously starts to happen. And it is my belief that there are ways to do it, and each time we do it, it brings more, but there are ways to do it in bigger contexts. And so I've been exploring that also with how can we gather large groups of people together, and can we help them unburden their racist parts, for example, and things like that in a kind of en masse arrangement. So I really believe in that kind of extending of what I call self, you call awareness, work in general is crucial, especially now.